the judges ready? Timer?
Yes.
First of all, I apologize for the fact that I know I sound like a frog with laryngitis. I'm losing my voice, so just trying to keep it together in this speech. A couple of preliminary comments, though, I'd like to make before I really get into the line-by-line argumentation. And the first preliminary comment I'd like to make is that it is critical to us as policymakers, as we're stimulating policymakers in policy debate, it is critical to mirror what happens in the real world and how our Constitution works in the real world, how our government actually plays out. Not just in the text of the Constitution, but also how it plays out in the real world. It's critical to mirror how the real world works in policy debate. My second preliminary comment, though, is that of the balance of power. Now, the affirmative speaker talks a lot about this in the 2AC, how we need to have separation of powers and balance of power. I'd like to point out that this balance of power, it is divided in two ways. There are two primary checks on our individual liberty in the United States of America. The first is that our federal government has 3 branches. So each of the branches check each other. There's a second, though, critical check for individual liberty, and that is between the federal government and the state and local governments. That is another critical means of ensuring that individual liberty is protected. We see the affirmative team's plan, it has the federal government solely, and Congress really, solely talking about what is or is not constitutional, completely bypassing the state and local governments. We actually uphold the balance of power and the separation of powers better through the negative team's counter plan, because we keep in mind that it's truly the states and the local governments that are supposed to be looking at constitutional amendments. So we look at that second check on individual liberty. Liberty is actually further upheld through the negative counter plan than through the affirmative team's plan. Let's start off by looking at the solvency argument, though, which is that the Supreme Court will strike down the ban. Now, Josh responded to this in his speech by saying we can fiat the Supreme Court, or basically mandate that they're going to comply with this plan. I have several responses because this is really important to understand how this is not the case and should not be allowed to happen under the affirmative team's plan. My first response is that precedent supports rulemaking. Only constitutional amendment can really change this. The Supreme Court has ruled over and over and over again in favor of delegated rulemaking. In some cases, it is actually mandated that the EPA exercise policy authority and carry through regulations. So the affirmative team is basically saying that the Supreme Court is going to completely bypass, completely forget all of its precedents that it's passed time and time again and say, oh, we changed our minds, now we're doing this. This is completely going against what happens in the real world. The Supreme Court acts on precedent and it reviews laws that Congress passes. In the real world, the Supreme Court has time and time again said we will tolerate this. My second response is that they cannot fiat the courts. There are several reasons for this. First of all, the resolution says the United States federal government will change its policy. Now, the Supreme Court is not a policy maker. The Supreme Court reviews policy, not making it. The affirmative team has to act as a policy maker, judges. They're proposing policy. They're acting as Congress, proposing a policy change. They can't act as Congress and act as the Supreme Court when they're proposing policy, because the Supreme Court does not make policy. The Supreme Court only reviews policy that has already been passed. They step way beyond their power when they do this. The third reason they can't fiat the Supreme Court is that the Supreme Court acts on precedent, not congressional mandates. I talked about this earlier. The last reason they cannot fiat the Supreme Court is that it predetermines constitutionality. Essentially, what the affirmative speaker did in his last speech is he said, we can fiat that our case is constitutional, and we can fiat that it will work. They've basically completely taken all of our ground in today's debate round, because they've said even if the Constitution doesn't say that delegated rulemaking is unconstitutional, we're going to make it unconstitutional. We're going to make the Supreme Court uphold this in every single instance, only for environmental policy, and we're going to make it happen. They basically mandated their solvency and are claiming to be able to fiat their solvency. The Supreme Court is a key player, a negative ground actually, as a check on affirmative solvency, and they've taken this ground by claiming to fiat the Supreme Court. So moving on now to the third reason that the Supreme Court is going to strike down this policy, and this was really completely unaddressed by Josh in his last speech, that it's inconsistent. We are allowing delegated rulemaking for every other area of policy after the affirmative team's plan, but not for environmental policy. There is no way. It's either constitutional or it's not constitutional, and the counter plan clarifies this issue once and for all. But under the affirmative team's interpretation, you have the Supreme Court saying it's unconstitutional in one way and constitutional in all the other ways. There is no way the Supreme Court in the real world would uphold that. There is no way the Founding Fathers would ever approve of that, an inconsistent way of looking at the Constitution. This brings me to my last argument, that of original intent. First of all, the affirmative team's own evidence said that in the Constitution there is no non-delegation principle. Their correspondent James Madison was not talking about delegation. He just said we don't think the legislative should have too much power. We agree, we don't think the legislative should have too much power. My final response under original intent is that the constitutional amendment clarifies this issue once and for all. We say the Constitution is unclear on the issue of delegation. By resorting to the state and local governments to determine whether or not how we're going to amend the Constitution, we clarify this issue once and for all and establish a consistent policy. So I urge you to vote negative. Thank you.
Is the affirmative team not part-time?
Yes, it is.